Lesson 9.4, solving quadratic equations by completing the square. In this lesson, you will learn to complete the square, to write perfect trinomials, and also solve quadratic equations by completing the square. And the vocabulary for this section is completing the square. So the idea behind completing the square is it helps you to solve any quadratic equation, whereas when we were using factoring, you could only use factoring to solve it if it factored. But if it was prime, it didn't work. Or when we were graphing, you would get sometimes decimal answers and you had to approximate. So this is a more exact way to get exact answers. Okay, so completing the square. To complete the square for any quadratic expression of the form x squared plus bx, follow the steps below. So we want to find half of b, which is the coefficient of the x term. And then we square the result that we get from b divided by 2, or half of it, and then we add that to the x squared plus bx. And when you do this, it makes it a perfect square. So, for example, in this case, we want to know what b is. So in this case, a is 1 and b is negative 12. So if I want to figure out what c is, what that number is that I'm going to add, I'm going to do negative 12 divided by 2 and then square it. So negative 12 divided by 2 is negative 6, and negative 6 squared is 36. That means my c is 36. So that's going to be x squared minus 12x plus 36. Now, if I were to factor this, I'm looking for terms that multiply to 36 and add to 12. Or I can see, okay, what's the square root of this? That's x. What's the square root of this? It's 6. 6 times x times 2 does give you 12. So this is going to be x minus 6 squared. Okay, so we came up with a value of c that made it a perfect square trinomial. Okay, so we want to be able to solve equations by using this method in a way. So what I want to do, first step in this is to move everything except the x squared and the x. So any of the constants to the other side. So first thing I'm going to do is subtract 5. So I'm going to get x squared plus 6x equals 7. Okay, now I want to have a value c that I can add. That's going to make this a perfect square trinomial. But I can't just add something to an equation and have it still be equal. So if I add c over here, I also want to add that c on this side. So I need to know what that c is. So remember, c is b over 2 squared. So our b in this case is the number in front of x. It's 6. 6 over 2 is 3, and 3 squared is 9. So that means c is 9. So I'm going to add c to both sides. So I'm going to have x squared plus 6x plus 9 equals 7 plus 9, which is 16. Okay, so if I factor this side, this squared here, you can think of it as perfect square trinomial because we just said it's going to work. That's x, and that's 3, right? 3 squared is 9. X times 3 times 2 does give me 6. So this is going to be x plus 3 squared. Okay, now if you remember from a previous section, we could do, to get rid of this square to get x by itself, I can do the opposite, which is the square root. If I square root both sides, I get x plus 3, because the square and the square root cancel, and then it's this plus or minus the square root of 16, which is 4. Okay, so I have x plus 3 equals plus or minus 4. So I can say x is going to be negative 3 plus or minus 4. So negative 3 plus 4, we're going to get 1. And negative 3 minus 4, we're going to get negative 7. So your solutions are 1 or negative 7. Okay, what happens if we don't have 1 in front of the x squared, or if we don't have a equals to 1? Well, we're going to follow similar methods. So first step, we still want to get all the constants onto one side. So I'm going to do plus 10, and I'm going to get negative 2x squared plus 36x equals 34. From here, I want to get this to be a coefficient of 1. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull out a negative 2. And I'm left with x squared minus 18x equals 34. Okay, and I want to be adding something to each side. But before I do that, I can get rid of this negative 2. So I'm going to divide both sides by negative 2. So if I do that, I get x squared minus 18x equals negative 17. Okay, so I need to know what I'm adding to each side. I want to find my value c that I'm going to add. All right, if I add c there, I also have to add it here. So what is c going to be? C is equal to b over 2 squared. So my b now is negative 18, not this one, right? So negative 18 over 2, I get negative 9 squared, so that's going to be 81. So I'm going to write this as x squared minus 18x plus 81, and then this is negative 17 plus 81. So this side on the left factors into its perfect square trinomial, and it's going to become x minus 9 squared, and 81 minus 17 is 64. So from here, to get x by itself, I want to do the opposite. I want to get rid of this squared, so I'm going to do the square root of both sides. And I get x minus 9 equals plus or minus 8. So then I get x equals, adding 9 to both sides, 9 plus or minus 8. 9 plus 8, I get 17. And 9 minus 8, I get 1. So your answers are x equals 17 or x equals 1. Okay, example 4. Solve a problem by completing the square. Suppose the rate of flow of an 80-foot wide river is given by the equation negative 0.01 x squared plus 0.8x, where r is the rate in miles per hour and x is the distance from the shore in feet. Jacqueline does not want to paddle his canoe against the current that is faster than 5 miles per hour. At what distance from the riverbank must he paddle in order to avoid a current of 5 miles per hour? Okay, so we want the rate to be less than 5, right? So I'm going to look for that point. So I'm going to do negative 0.01 x squared plus 0.8x. And we want this amount to be less than or equal to 5. Okay? Because he doesn't want to overcome that. So the first thing I need to do in solving this by completing this square is to get rid of this 0.01. So I'm going to divide out negative 0.01. So 0.1, if I pull that out, I'm left with x squared. 0.8 divided by negative 0.01 gives negative 80. So this becomes negative 80x, and then we want this to be something 5. Okay, so I'm going to divide both sides now by this 0.01, negative 0.1. So when I do that with 5 divided by 0.01, I get 500. So we want 500 because we divided by a negative. This is going to switch directions, and we're going to get x squared minus 80x. And I want to add c to both sides so that I can see what I need to make this a perfect square trinomial. Sorry, this is 80x. So remember, c is b over 2 squared. So 80 divided by 2 is 40, and 40 squared is 1600. So I'm going to have x squared minus 80x plus 1600. And then on this side, 500 plus 1600. Okay, factoring this side, this is going to be x minus 40 squared is less than or equal to 500 plus 1600 is 2100. Okay, so now I take the square root of both sides, and I get x minus 40 is greater than or equal to plus or minus 45.825 about. So I'm going to say this is x has to be greater than or equal to 40 plus or minus 45.825. So I'm going to get x is going to be greater than or equal to, when I add those two together, I get 85.825. Okay, that's the distance. And if I were to do minus, I would get negative, but you can't have a negative distance, so that doesn't make sense. So my answer is going to be 85.825. Okay, what distance from the riverbank? He must paddle to that point in order to avoid the current. And that is less than 9.4.